This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is Erik Ohlsen, a US-based regenerative designer, permaculturist, landscape contractor, author, farmer, herbalist, storyteller, and practitioner of Nordic folk traditions. His approach to regenerative landscaping is rooted in decades of practical experience and a humbleness that allows Erik to be led by what the land has to tell him.
When I was 19, I got involved with a group of friends. We had just discovered the threat of Terminator seed technology created by the Monsanto Corporation. This is genetically engineered technology that would make their seeds pollen sterile. And so at the age of 19, I hadn't gone to college yet. I was looking for a purpose, a place in the world, and we kind of found out about this, what seemed like the death of all plants if this got out in the natural environment. So my friends and I started a nonprofit. It was called Planting Earth Activation, PEA, like the pea plant. And our goal was to give seed gardens away and grow heirloom open pollinated seeds. So this was our nonprofit, started in 1999. Between 1999 and 2001, we gave over 200 gardens away, saved tens of thousands of seeds, and created a bit of a seed bank in our community. And those efforts, young folks getting into the land, getting into gardening, wanting to do right, attracted the eye of some of the mentors around here, folks who are into permaculture and regenerative design and activism. And through that, some of the elders sort of took me under their wing and brought me into the fold with their organizations. And we're talking about Starhawk with the Earth Activist Training, and Penny Livingston Stark with the Regenerative Design Institute, Brock Dolman with the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center. These were very important mentors, and they kind of brought me up at a young age and started giving me opportunities to deepen with permaculture and activism, and away I went.
Amazing. And we were talking beforehand, you've got a book out called The Regenerative Landscaper, and it is, as I referred to it, a bit of a Bible for anybody who wants to garden in tune with the land. How did the idea for the book come about? Is it literally you've just documented all of your experience and put it in one place?
So I've been doing regenerative design now for 25 plus years. And through the process of working with nonprofits, working in my own design contracting business, working with activist grassroots groups, working with schools and businesses and residences and farms and ranches, as time went on, it became clear that we needed a regenerative design manual that wasn't just focused on theory, but also looked at the really practical side of building a garden, building a landscape, and practical to the point of view that it fits for everyone, whether you're a backyard gardener or you're running your own landscape design company or you're working for a nonprofit organization or a city. There's real practical sides of doing the work, such as how do we source materials? How do we look at budgeting? How do we look at timeline? That when we combine those with ecological principles, with the goal of becoming place-based people, of living off the land, with the land. That's kind of how this book emerged, The Regenerative Landscaper, to impart kind of the ancient wisdom stuff of, how people lived in harmony with landscapes, plus the most cutting edge science around soil science, around water science, like understanding how the ecosystem works, how the earth works, and how we can use the processes of soil regeneration and water purification and food production. We can use these sciences, combine them with the ancient principles, and then implement them in our modern day economy. So that was the goal of the book, to kind of bring all that together and really give a modern day ancient wisdom manual that folks could implement, something that isn't just theory that you can actually implement. So the book itself is 25 plus years of my experience doing that. And after a while, it just felt like I need to write this book. I probably stewed on it for about 5 years before I started, thinking I have to get this book out. And then I finally started, and it took about 4 years to produce.
Wow. I mean, it is, as you say, it's so practical, and you say it can be used at scale because there's a bit of a divide between people who are doing backyard gardening and people who are gardening at a larger scale, maybe doing permaculture and doing small holdings, that kind of thing. So you think just take the principles and then expand on them, I guess. Is that the theory?
Yeah, expand on them and show how the implementation side of it. I mean, I think, we're talking about all kinds of folks here, right? We're talking about you just going out and growing some fruits and veggies and herbs in your garden. And then folks who are, I want to regenerate planet Earth. I want to do this as a living. I want to support my community and revegetate the land. And so within all of that, what we find is the obstacles isn't really the how to is not quite as much the obstacle. The planning is the problem. The social side, the communication, how do we manage the money? How do we source materials? These tend to be things that don't often get talked about in the more theory spaces or even in a permaculture design course necessarily. So really wanting this to be a kind of one-stop shop, that book to be something that folks can refer to for years, for decades, and still be a relevant source for doing the work.
I mean, it is quite a blueprint for anybody to use, like I said, independent of what scale they're working at. And the subtitle of the book refers to how human interaction can help to repair landscapes. And that, for
Mm.
me, is actually something that I kind of debate often because I think there's a sort of element of human hubris in this where we kind of go, we have to manage, we have to get involved in order for this landscape to regenerate. But you actually document the sort of processes that humans are encouraging and facilitating through working with the landscape. Obviously, you don't want to give too much away, but that was a really interesting thing for me, the sort of natural regenerative disturbances that we should be looking to mimic in our gardens. Are there maybe one or two you'd like to talk about that people might not have necessarily thought about, or maybe they have, just, you kind of map it out in a very practical way?
Absolutely. At first, I want to mention I'm in California, United States, Northern California. I'm on the territory of coastal Miwok and Southern Pomo. And the folks here who've been here for 10,000 plus years, and the whole state of California, really, when settlers arrived here, it was paradise, paradise on earth, paradise garden, the whole state. And they dubbed it wilderness, just wild and pristine wilderness, when in truth, it was a managed landscape, managed through indigenous practices for, 10,000 plus years. And so what we learn from the indigenous communities here is that this interaction with ecosystem processes, whether it's the use of fire or it's the use of the predator prey patterns, these are inherently integral to how people have interacted with landscape the world over. And that when we insert ourselves as a harmonious part of an ecosystem cycle, as a relator to all the other elements of that ecosystem, then we find ways where we can generate abundance in cooperation with soil and water and birds and trees and seeds. So, as you mentioned in my book, I describe some of the ancient ways and modern ways that folks have done that, and some of the regenerative disturbances we find in nature. And I think my favorite one has to do with vegetation management, that what someone might call mowing. I had a client recently designing this 25-acre farm, and they had sown a cover crop, and then they told me, this was some months ago, they said, okay, Eric, we're going to go out and mow the 25 acres. And so I had a discussion with them. I said, well, what kind of mowing? And they kind of looked at me. What do you mean? What kind of mow? Like, we're going to go just mow 25 acres. And I think that what the majority of modern land stewards are still needing to understand is that when we just do what we call mow, blow, and go, when we just kind of like mow everything, blow off the pathways and leave, we're doing a disservice to ecosystem processes. And if we can mimic the patterns of ruminant animals, the patterns of a natural fire, the patterns of a flood, these disturbances that we find in nature which don't just indiscriminately take out the whole 25 acres. There's choice there. When we can mimic these patterns in our own gardens, we create a much more dynamic set of yields, harvests, and we're managing more cycles. And so what I mean by that, as I told my client, instead of going out and just mowing 25 straight acres, let's first take some time to see what's happening out there. Are there native wildflowers coming into bloom? Are there quail or killdeer creating their ground nests right now? Are there certain species, native grasses and such, that we want to select for? Are there certain species, maybe more opportunistic, some call invasive plants, we want to deselect for? And when we have this bigger tapestry, this bigger picture of what's happening, then we can strategically mow, not mow the whole thing at one time, but mow certain areas as if a herd of elk came through and had their choice pickings, because they're not going to go and eat 25 straight acres. They're going to pick and choose what they want. They'll stomp some things, they'll chew some things, and that process will actually invigorate ecosystem function. It'll create more growth, more biodiversity, more habitat. And so if we can bring that sort of principled thinking and strategy into our gardens, even just our small landscape, and you go out and you think about, how am I going to cut plants back? How am I going to mow this pasture? How am I going to manage my trees? And you do so in a way that takes into consideration the nesting habits of birds, the life cycle of beneficial insects, the flower and seed production of specific plants. Then we become selectors for a more biodiverse and dynamic process in our gardens.
I think maybe what puts people off of doing that or taking that approach is just a complete lack of knowledge, really. You do have to be knowledgeable to observe and to read the landscape like that. How do you actually read a landscape? How do you get in tune with it?
The first thing you do is actually erase any concept that you know anything. People look sideways at me when I say that, but when I go out onto a landscape, and of course I have half a lifetime of experience, so that is the foundation that I can move from later in the process. But my initial process of reading landscape is to go out onto a site and really tell myself I know nothing, and I've just asked questions. So a great question to ask is when? When are we in the landscape right now? And that is a question that speaks to seasonality. It speaks to the different phases that plants or animals might be in, whether it's sprouting, fruit, seed, nesting, whatever. So it's a when. When are we in the landscape right now? It also speaks to a bigger question of in the greater succession. I live in an area where we have the old growth redwoods, largest trees on the planet, and they can grow to be 4,000 years old. Well, they didn't start like that. They started somewhere, probably with a forest fire, which turned into a pastoral system, which then oaks came, and eventually over generations, the redwoods came, and eventually over generations, it became an old growth forest. So when I walk onto a site, I ask when as a way to triangulate where I am in the greater succession of ecosystem. So I sit, I ask questions, I just watch, I just take time. I walk in a state of awareness. I see what insects are doing. I see what's sprouting, what's fruiting. I feel the wind. We are blessed with bodies, our human bodies, and all of our sensory perception is the greatest tool for reading nature, the greatest tool. Where do you feel hot on a site? Where do you feel cold on a site? Where do you feel wind? Where do you feel protection? What are the shapes and patterns? Where is it moist? Can you feel moisture in some places and dry in other places? So I walk in the landscape in such a way where I allow my body to be the main tool of perception, less so my mind, and just take in as much information as possible, really looking at relationships between things. And I think this is one core principle of this work when you're becoming a co-participant in an emerging natural system. It's about how things relate to each other, the relationship between a tree and a bird, or between a waterway and the plants along the edge and the sun. How are these relationships? What are they doing? And so I don't try to go for answers. I just try to go for questions. I spend a lot of time listening. And I'll even tell clients, because I do this work professionally, and I'll tell clients, I'll say, if they hire me to do a design, well, I need some time on the land without you, just by myself, because having a client there chirping in your ear and asking questions is a big distraction. So I'll always make sure I have time to be on the land by myself. What I say is you'll really hear the voice of the land, hear the patterns. But what that means is just listening and observing. And often the aha moments don't happen when I'm there. It often will happen later in the day or later in the week. Maybe I'm taking a shower, I'm going to bed or something, and something clicks. And those aha moments about a particular interaction in the landscape will often become a foundation for the design process further on.
So you mentioned being strategic as well, and that was another thing that struck me from the book. I think that it's very important to have an overarching vision and theme for your garden. Am I right in thinking that?
Definitely.
I mean, obviously, through the observation, you go about that. When you start, do you map out that vision and that theme? And then how much does that change as you get on the ground and start working, do you think? Is that process open to evolving into something that you didn't necessarily start out with?
Yes. The process is always it's an evolution like any natural system would be. So the process of design implementation, if you really want to be true to working in a back and forth with the ecosystem and the context, which is the human context as well, then things will evolve in the middle. And I've worked on enough projects to know they'll constantly evolve, no matter how well you think that you've designed it and or created an installation plan. As any contractor of any sort of project will tell you, there will be things that you didn't plan for that will emerge in the process, and you'll have to just figure them out. But the more strategic we are, the more efficient we can be, the better we can stick to budgets, the better we can be sensitive to particular ecosystem elements that might require sensitivity. So how it usually works in our process is we do the observation, then we start working up a conceptual design. And the conceptual design will include the vision of the client or myself, if it's my own place, or yourself, if it's your own place. What's your vision? What's the land tell us? What are the limiting factors? We live in a drought area, so some people have no water. That's a big limiting factor. Other areas, they may have too much water. That could be a limiting factor. So what are the limiting factors on the site? Always it's site specific, always site specific, this whole process. But then a question that often comes up when I work with clients, especially, and listeners, you can reflect for yourself too. Do you want to design something that is multi-generational, something that's legacy, where you're thinking for generations in the future? Like, for instance, planting an olive tree by seed. It might take decades before it grows and matures and produces a fruit. So are you looking at it from that way, or do you just want something now and quick? And sometimes I work with people who they know they're only going to be in a place for 2 or 3 years and they just want something now and quick. So that's their context. And I mention this because for folks who want the long vision, you might create a design for yourself that will take you 20, 30, 50 years to implement. That might seem way out of your budget at the beginning. But because you're thinking generationally, you don't worry as much about the budget. You worry about the process. And so the way I work with folks with this is we create a phased plan. This is where the strategy really comes into play. And we create the design, we agree on a design, and then we start to think about, well, what do we do in the first year? What are the first 3 years? Or do we want to accomplish? And we start looking at it in these increments, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. And when you create this timeline, a lot of great things happen if you do that at the beginning, create this timeline. One, you start to refine your vision. You start to realize, actually, I don't think I want that. If I plant that in 10 years, that's going to be a lot of work managing. Maybe I don't want to press olives. Okay, let's not do olives. It might help with some of the decision making. But the other piece is you start to identify what you need to do now to accomplish your goal that you're reaching for in 5 years. And so you start to lay the groundwork. Like I mentioned before about succession in nature, this is how ecosystems evolve. They start at an early succession and then they continue to evolve in such a way where they get more biodiverse and more dynamic. And that's how we want to treat our design. That's the strategy for implementing a design as well. So maybe we focus on soil for the first couple of years and get some key trees in the ground. And in year 2, we start to put in different infrastructure elements. It all depends on people's budget, the site specificity, and a whole lot of factors. But this planning approach I've found to be so helpful for people, because what happens is you get really excited. I mean, I see this all the time. People get an idea for their garden. They get so excited and they go out and they start planning it out and they start doing stuff. And then they run into, oh no, I can't do this because it costs too much, or it's not the right time of the year. And you start to feel uninspired, start to feel a little down. And so many projects get abandoned through the process because there wasn't enough ahead of time thinking about how to plan this out in a way that fits the people involved, that fits the landscape involved. So that being said, I also really discourage people from not doing anything in the first years. That is also a problem too. We call it analysis paralysis, where you spend so much time in planning that you're afraid to do anything. And that is just as bad as having no planning. I've had folks who've spent 10 years trying to figure out what they're going to do without doing anything. So there's a balance to be had between really good strategic planning and just go start interacting, go plant some things, go cut some things back, go do some stuff. Natural ecosystems are very forgiving. They're not as permanent in our concept as, say, like an old stone church in Europe might feel permanent. They can change and evolve very quickly. So go out there and just start doing stuff and observe and make adjustments as you go. That's really one of the most important ways to go about it while you're doing your strategic planning.
So be thoughtful, but don't be scared to get your hands dirty, basically.
See, you said it in like 5 words. It took me about 1,000 words.
Yeah, but yours were much better. There are so many things in the book that I could talk about, all the practical advice that you give, and there are so many nuggets of gold in there. But there was one thing that I sort of jumped out, because we've got limited time, obviously. And I wanted to ask you about how you would manage your soil seed bank, because I found that really interesting.
Yes, a topic I love to speak about. People are so worried about their weeds. I can't tell you how many times people talk to me about their weeds. Oh, my weeds, and I got a weed, and how do you deal with weeds? And obviously, certain kinds of weeds can be the bane of a gardener or a landscaper. And I completely understand that. And I have particular ones that I feel the same way. One really incredible strategy that is more of a close to home. It's like for your small farm, your small holding, your landscape, your garden, less so. It's a different strategy when we think about big rural stewardship ranches and things. But what you do is you intentionally change the seed bank of your soil. So that way the weeds that grow are plants that you love, plants that you use. And the way you do that is you start to sow plants that will reseed themselves, like calendula, like chrysanthemum, poppy, Spanish lavenders, and the list goes on and on and on and on and on. And you plant those plants, you let them seed. And every year you sow more of these types of biennial plants and let them go to seed. And what starts to happen is year after year, the weeds that grow up start to be these plants that you can harvest for food, medicine, fiber, build soil, attract habitat. And eventually, those will be 90% of what you would call weeds are going to be these plants. And then you can pull them out if you want, or you can harvest them. You can let them have space. But every year, you want to let some of them go to seed again. So you continue to replenish that seed bank.
Eventually, do they outcompete the weeds? Because obviously a lot of weeds are designed to be very good at propagating themselves.
Everything is seasonal. Some years I see that the plants I select for are out competing, but depending on the climate that year, whether we had more or less rain or heat waves or whatnot, certain other plants might emerge or take over. So it's definitely a year to year thing. And in some areas, like if you're very intensive, you can essentially completely eradicate particular non-desirable weeds from an area if it's very intensive. So it's kind of a yes, no answer to that.
So I like to leave on a positive. There's a lot of things in gardening at the moment that, we are dealing with as gardeners and as people who are concerned about climate and the planet. What words of encouragement would you give to anybody who's starting at big or small site? What would you say to them?
I would say one of the most important things we can do is trust the wisdom of Earth's systems. And what I mean by that is the carbon cycle, the water cycle, the photosynthesis, the biological activity. When we work in cooperation with nature rather than fighting against it, we literally create paradise on Earth. Earth is paradise. And what we can see in the garden, on the land, when we honor the ecosystem, when we come from a place of reciprocity where we want to create things better than we find them, is the land responds tenfold, 100-fold, 1,000-fold. I've seen it over the years in many, many gardens and farms. Landscapes that were destitute, even parking lots, have been turned into thriving ecosystems that are producing food and medicine and have incredible biodiversity and plant and animal species. And this is all so possible. It's so doable. It really is. There's no reason to hold back from doing this work. And as a contributor to sequestering carbon and battling climate change and cooling the earth down, every one of these activities contributes to that. And so I would just say, don't be afraid to get out there, start experimenting, take time to listen to the nature in your area so that you're working in harmony with those specific ecosystems, and then keep going. People always say to me, well, I'm renting. I don't want to build a garden where I rent. And I think, well, why not? Why not? Why not have the wake of your life, the wake of your activity, the places that you visit be gardens sprouting up under your feet and from your hands everywhere you go? Why not do that? You can always take cuttings, you can always propagate and harvest seed from any garden you make and take it to the next one. But this is our opportunity. We have an opportunity every single day to engage in a reciprocal way with the natural world, and it responds, and it gives us food, and it gives us medicine, and it reduces our stress and gives us peace of mind. And so this is the choice we get to make every day. And I think it's a beautiful path to be on the path of the gardener, the farmer, to steward the land, and the yields will speak for themselves.
Thank you very much to Erik for a fantastic interview and for the gift that is the Regenerative Landscaper book. Thank you as well for listening. If you like this interview, I recommend checking out episode 210 with Sid Hill, released on the 3rd of October 2022, and episode 233, Ecologically Integrated Gardens, with Sean Mastretti of Studio Petrichor, who was the reason I found Erik. So thank you, Sean. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.